stage because I don't want you to pollute their minds anymore. Can you all hear?
Yes.
I spoke recently at a place and I asked whether people could hear, and somebody at the back said he could, but he was quite happy to swap with someone who couldn't. So, my problem is I can't see. What you've just heard from Ian is a passionate statement from the researcher who wants to be allowed to get on with things, doesn't want to, as it were, be required to jump through any hoops. And I have to tell you in about 15 minutes why hoops are important, but they shouldn't be regarded as impediments. Why you get stuff from Everest, I haven't the remotest idea, but you probably failed to tick the box in your GDC or GMC thing which says, I do not want my name to be shared. And there's always, under data protection legislation, an opportunity to tick a box saying you may not share my information with anybody else. And then, if they do, they're in breach. So, next time you look at the form, tick the box and say it's true of every commercial arrangement you enter into. Anyway, let's begin at the beginning. You've heard Ian, who is, on everybody's reckoning, a star. Not only because of his surgical skills, but of course his entrepreneurial skills in bringing together a lot of people who are interested in, as he says, poignantly and accurately, actually just caring for and about patients. And research in this particular area, which Ian is a significant world leader, is particularly short in supply. It has been a neglected area of research. It isn't as perhaps alluring to some as other areas, and for that reason Ian and others, and I've been happy to go along on the coattails of it, have been anxious to say, hang on, this is an important area of medical and surgical expertise and suffering. We need to do research just as much as we need to do research on breast cancer or pancreatic cancer or lung cancer or whatever else that's the fashion du jour. And therefore, how can we generate it? And Ian's been on a journey in that regard for some years, and it's a journey which is still going on, still trying to engage people, and it is very important that you are starting out in your young professional lives should see not only what Ian is doing as important in the area of particularly maxillofacial stuff, but also to inculcate into you the idea that you may well be going on to be young surgeons, but you're also young discoverers, you're also inquirers about the truth and about how you can become better, not only for yourself, but for those who are your colleagues and those whom you serve. So it's in that spirit of seeing the purpose of research as an intrinsic important element in what is the armamentarium of doctors, nurses and other professionals that I'm going to speak. And I'm only going to say a few words. I don't have any slides because I'm far too old to be able to negotiate a computer. I have a pen and a piece of paper and some spectacles, and still I can't see a thing. I've said to you that research is important. And although you heard Ian's passionate, they're all in my bloody face, get them out of here so I can get on with it, ethics isn't about getting in your face. It isn't about getting in the way. It is, however, about doing what you want to do with respect for the future, the past, patients, your colleagues, in other words, for certain fundamental values. Now, we don't talk about research in healthcare. You're much too young to realize this, except for Ian. We don't talk about research in healthcare in the abstract. In my lifetime, there was a group of people, not 1,000 miles, not 800 miles from here, who were, for example, suspending prisoners of war in chambers, decompression chambers, and watching what happened as they removed the air, and monitoring the point at which they died, and recording that on film. And I've seen the film. And this was so that they could prepare their pilots who had to go into steep dives or steep climbs, engaging in dogfights in the Second World War. There were people who were rubbing all sorts of extraneous elements into abrasions they'd made in the skin of young people to see how long it took for them to die of gangrene, and monitoring this day by day with meticulous recording, so as to understand, in quotation marks, what was the progress of this condition, and what point it was pointless to intervene, because they intervened in some case, they tried other. There were people who were taking twins and doing various things to these twins, which are to see whether exposing them to psychological or physical effects and putting them back together affected how they related to each other. And I needn't go on. That's the Second World War. That's Dr. Karl Brandt and many others. And if any of you want to spend a time thinking about what the challenge Ian's just thrown out, go to a library and pull out the trial transcripts of the Nuremberg trials and read the trial of Karl Brandt, as I have done, page after page after page, and then realize why we are where we are. Because we're part of a European community where at least the Germans, conscious of their history, are saying research on patients, research on humans, steady on. Do it carefully. Don't go anywhere too rapidly, too incautiously, too unaware of the rights and the need to respect patients. So that's the historical context. It's not context-free, what I'm talking about. And we know recent experiences in prisons in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, and Northern Ireland in the 1970s. It is not a phenomenon that you are in any way responsible for, but you understand that states and governments begin to pass laws and begin to introduce legislative and regulatory frameworks because of that history. And my job is, if I have one, my day job is to regulate MPs' expenses, which is a bit like sticking needles in your eye every day. What I do also is to try and find a way through. And so it's not to be regarded as a trivial matter or a pain in the neck, although it might be. It's not about ticking boxes, and there are bureaucracies, and there is a need to constantly to re-evaluate these bureaucracies and make them come together. And there is a bit of an industry of patients who are PAG, metamorphosing into stuff. These are the groups which are slightly over-precious in protecting each and every patient, even against themselves. It was often said that Sidney Poitier was the kind of black man who would help an old lady across the road, even if she didn't want to cross. PAG is the kind of body that would protect the patient even against him or herself. And there are those, if you like, necessary impediments which are a product of the context. I chair a body which is called UK Research Integrity Organisation, which is about trying to help people like Ian and others give advice. We've developed a code of practice. We offer training, and I recommend that Ian and those of you who are leaders in this field contact UK RIO, and go on the website and see our guidance on how to conduct research, and our training. We have a board of advisors who can come and advise you and tell you about how to deal with particular problems, and if anything goes wrong, to come to me. Let's begin at the beginning, and I won't go on for more than about 5 more minutes. Begin at the beginning. You want to do some research. Let's imagine. We won't talk about Ian, we'll talk about the notional person. You want to do some research. And I'm going to say something which you may find really quite difficult to deal with, because Ian certainly does. It's not enough that you want to know the answer. It's not enough that you think it's important to know the answer. That's not enough to entitle you to do it. The pursuit of knowledge is not an absolute value. The pursuit of knowledge must be on certain conditions, on certain terms. It's not an absolute good, because otherwise we'd be hanging from straps in a decompression chamber, because we wanted to know what happened. So it's on terms. The mere wanting to know is not enough. What's involved in finding out must be morally acceptable, according to universal principles, of which there are agreed universal principles. So let me take you through a number of steps. Not very many, but it's not going to be exhaustive because I don't have very much time. I could bore for England on this, but I've already demonstrated that to good effect. I'm just going to talk about ethics. There is legal stuff out here, and you've got to know that. You've got to be part of an institution, part of a team that can help you. And again, UK Rio is the place where you can go to have help on that. But the first thing is, understand what ethics is about. It's really to try and discover what's the right thing to do here. What is the right thing to do? It's usually something that comes from here. You feel it or you don't, or if you don't, you're probably a psychopath. For psychopaths means surgery, of course. So it's about what's right in terms of, we usually talk in terms of people having rights, that's you having rights, and other people who are engaging with them having duties to them, rights and duties. And you've got an idea, you want to do it, and you understand that there's this ethical, legal superstructure. The first thing is you've got to come up with a project. Now, if it's a crap project, scientifically crap, then it's ipso facto unethical, because good ethics has to be good science. So it's got to be something that's plausible. You've got to run it past your scientific colleague. Will this work? Is this a fair hypothesis, and so on and so forth? Otherwise, you shouldn't be doing it. It's not. You can't be in the game of, oh, I'd like to know this. If I operate, it used to be the case where a surgeon would write in the Lancet, and before people like Ian developed the notion of proper research. I just did 6 operations to remove the appendix through the shoulder blade. None of them worked. This isn't a very good idea. That's not too great a pastiche from the past. And now we're in the world whereby just having a go isn't right. You have to demonstrate that this is at least plausible scientifically. Okay, once you've done that, you need to go to some group, and they've gone through many manifestations. It used to be a sort of old cleric and maybe a nurse, and now it's almost an industry of people who sit on ethics committee. But one way or another, you've got to go and get approval. You've got to make sure that you ask the right question, get the right answer. If you want to do this, you've got to ask to do that. You don't vary from it. You've got to say what kind of group you're going to research on, what kind of consent you're going to ask for, how you explain it. I know it's a pain in the neck, but it means you've thought it through. You've actually thought it through. What happens when they wake up and say, I didn't realize that, and they get angry? If you've thought about it before, as I'll come to in a minute, then the ethics committee will be satisfied that what you're doing is has some ethical propriety. So you've got to go through that. And then you've got to remember that the bedrock of research, and we're largely talking about therapeutic research on patients. There is another form called non-therapeutic research on volunteers. You know, you're testing the possible effects of a drug or some other intervention on healthy people. That's even more circumscribed for obvious reasons. Here we're talking about patients. And the classic, the big arbiter about whether it's going to be proper or not, ethical or not, what the committee is concerned with, what the law is concerned with, hangs on this notion of consent. Something you're all familiar with already, yes? Although I have never been more surprised in my life. That's probably untrue, but I've rarely been more surprised in my life than when some young doctor gave evidence to me in Bristol, and it wasn't his fault. He hadn't been trained. It was the fault of those looking after him. And he said that he'd been sent to consent the parents. And I said, this is the first time, and I was interested, I'm interested in language. He said it was the first time that I ever heard the word consent used as a transitive verb, meaning by that a verb that commands an object rather than to seek consent as an adjective verb. Obviously my reference to the transitive verb bit went over his head just as it has over your head, because the teaching of anything to do with grammar and language and lots of style, but there we are. What I meant by that is you don't consent people, you ask for their consent. It's they who are in charge, it's their permission you're seeking. They're the ones who are going to be able to say, yes, you may touch me, or no, you may not. Every time a surgeon lays a hand, every time a doctor or a nurse lays a hand on anybody, he or she is committing a criminal offence. Unless they are allowed to do it, either by consent or because they're unconscious, or in other ways infer. You are the only group licensed by society to touch people. What you do would land most other people in jail. It's because we trust you, it's because we license you, and because you ask for permission. So that's the importance of consent. It's respectful, and in research it's extra respectful, because in research you're asking someone to behave generously. You're asking that person to lend himself or herself to a project which goes beyond himself, to the benefit of others, to develop generalizable knowledge. You're saying, will you, it's a huge act of solidarity, of community, of participation. Of course, I will benefit if I'm in the trial because I might get better treatment, and so on and so forth. I get Ian talking to me. You can't win them all, but on the other hand, there might be impediment to being a researcher. I can't go home when I thought I might be, and they're going to do more tests on me. And there might be the follow-up, which I don't want more forms to fill in. He talks about form, but the patient may have to do the same. So there are quids as well as quos. So you're asking someone to volunteer. Now what does consent mean? About which we can spend. I've written a book on medical law. Chapter on consent is 346 pages. I'm not going to go through every one today. It's very complicated. But at the bedrock, there are three principles. You've heard, I imagine already, the notion of informed consent. Does that nod those of you who are still awake? Nod, yes, okay, informed. Well, just take that notion out of your head. It doesn't mean it. Consent is the crucial thing, and there are three elements, and they're very important when you're doing research. First, you've got to be able to consent. That's quite problematic when you're dealing with young children or adolescents, or elderly confused, or those with mental illness. It's not a problem with unconscious people. It's obvious they can't consent. They may have written something beforehand, but with a sub-issue. So, maturity, level of contact or confusion, level of illness, the illness they actually have might impair their ability to comprehend, because comprehension is key. So when you want someone to volunteer for research, you've got to make sure that they know what they're signing up for and its implication. And people talk about there's got to be, this, that, this age or that age. It's not about age, it's about maturity. You can do research on a 15-year-old, let us say, who's mature and sufficiently au fait with his own and other circumstances, whereas you might be hesitant to do research on a confused 21-year-old who's in and out of drug use. You understand. The second, if capacity to consent and comprehend is the first, the second, I'll stop in about 3 minutes, so we're really worried about getting out.
I've got more to come, don't worry.
Not from me. The second element, after capacity to consent, is that the consent must be voluntary. Very often overlooked, and very, very, very difficult to comprehend from some medical school trained teachers who will sit here, who will stand here rather, and call you up. So, do you want to come up here? And if I was going to be his examiner at the end of the year, and I want to give him an aspirin tablet with a glass to demonstrate something, he'd bloody well fly up here. But he may not want to come up here. I've just used my status. I've just used my position. I've just used a kind of moral blackmail on him. I remember the story of the nurse saying the chap didn't want to take his medicine, he didn't want to take, she came back at 2 o'clock, she came back at 4, he still hadn't taken, he said, I don't like it, he gives me X or Y. So she came back at 6 o'clock, she said, oh please, take your medicine, I get into terrible trouble if you don't. So I took his medicine. Now that's duress in my language. He didn't want to take the medicine, leave him alone. But she blackmailed him. He wanted to make her feel better. Be very alert to how you deal with patients and their vulnerability in the context of research and volunteering. Be very alert that you don't take advantage of people. Some are gung-ho, some are reluctant. Be sensitive to that. And it's part of what makes you good doctor. And thirdly, if you've got to be able to comprehend, if you've got to be able to be voluntary, the third is you need to be sufficiently well informed of what's going to go on. And that is not fully informed. Nobody can be fully informed. That's just a nonsense written by bad lawyers. You've got to be adequately informed in the context of you and the circumstances. What do you have to be informed? What are you going to do to me, Doc? It's the first stage. What are the risks involved, Doc? Straight, honest answers required. What's going to happen after, Doc? And that's not just, well, you won't have a leg. It's, you'll have to learn how to dance on one leg. In other words, a psychological as well as a physical sequelae of any intervention. And then the follow-up and everything else. In other words, you just have to make sure that the person you have recruited, the volunteer whom you have recruited, understands what they're getting into at the level of your knowledge of them and your knowledge of what reasonable people would want to know. What am I going to do? What's it going to mean? What the psychological... Your particular patient who happens to be a ballet dancer will want to know whether she'll ever get on points again, because that's important to her. Or whether she'll have a scar here or there. That's important to her. So you need to tell her. Do you understand? Or the young boy who says, will I ever play football again? If you know he's interested in football, that's what you've got to tell him. You'll never play football again. If you think that's a risk of taking part in this research, we'll be trying this new technique. If we try that one, you might play football again, but you might drop down dead. At least he knows the choice. Do you understand what I'm saying? And that, all of that, everything I said there is about respect for people, and they are, and the knowledge that they're volunteers, they do what they do out of a sense of solidarity. Now the last thing I would mention is research is quite common in this country, although not in the area that Ian is interested in as much as it should be. research misconduct, failure to observe the kind of principles that I'm talking about, is not uncommon. Between, and it's very difficult to get figures, between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 100. Spread is that big of cases where patients have been taken advantage of, or research outliers have been massaged away to get in the way of what I want to prove, or other sorts of activity that take place. So misconduct does take place, and if you or any of you are ever come into contact with misconduct in research, you must know the harm it does to the very notion of research, to the institution, to the profession, and to the patient more than anyone else. Future patients, if someone's written up something that works, well, it hasn't, so cook the books, and to the patient who's been the object. So research misconduct is there, not in the area that we're talking about, but in other contexts, yes. You should be alert to it, and you should have nothing to do with it, and you will have nothing to do with it if you cleave to the sort of principles I've been talking about. Thanks.
Go.